Good evening, everyone. I'm Trey Johnson, and welcome to Museum After Hours, our monthly lecture series. Tonight, we're joined by Joanna Wickman, coming to us all the way from Casper, Wyoming. Wickman holds 4 college degrees and is the author of Lost Forts of Casper and the Forgotten Senator, The Life and Character of Preston B. Plumb. She's the president of Wickman Historical Consultants and has worked in museums in the history field for over 15 years and has been researching Preston B. Plumb for over a decade. Tonight's presentation covers the life of one of Kansas's most powerful and forgotten U.S. senators who not only transformed Kansas, but the entire United States during his time in office. Plumb smuggled weapons to Kansas territory, founded the town of Emporia, served in the Kansas state legislature, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and spent a significant 14 years in the U.S. Senate before dying tragically at the age of 54. Plumb's impact can still be felt today in the U.S. through the creation of the U.S. Forest Service, the Department of Agriculture, and the creation of Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. We'll have a brief question and answer period after our program this evening, so be sure to enter your questions into the Q&A feature, or you can use the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome Joanna Wickman to the program.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I get to talk about my favorite person.
Well, we are very glad to have you.
Well, thank you. So I want to just kind of be upfront. Preston Plum did an incredible amount of things in his 54-year life, and I'm going to move kind of quickly just to go through all of these because there are so many. Um, I'm also going to be reading some excerpts from my book, The Forgotten Senator. A big part of the book focuses on stories of people who knew Senator Plumb. So this way you can get kind of an idea of his personality, the vernacular of the time, more so than just facts and figures. So I wanted to start with this quote from him. This is from when he was in the Senate. This is from a bill that he proposed, well, he fought against actually, requiring the federal government to purchase ships from overseas. He felt that our U.S. Navy ships should be built in the United States. And I don't know if, depending on how you're viewing this, if it's readable, but I'll just go ahead and read it. He says, "There is no enterprise in the world beyond the ability of the American people to compass when once they address themselves to it. There is no problem their ingenuity cannot solve. There is no obstacle their courage will not overcome. There is no controversy in which they will ever engage, from which they will not emerge triumphant." And not only is this incredibly patriotic, but this is also Preston Plum. This is him in a quote. He was an incredible speaker, incredibly patriotic, capable of really motivating and encouraging large groups of people, very charismatic. And we're going to kind of see that unfold throughout his life. Go ahead and start here. So his early life, Preston Plum was born in 1837 in Ohio. As luck would have it, he was born October 12th. So in just a few days, it'll be his birthday. So remember that on Saturday, have a cupcake for him or something. Um, he was the oldest child of his family. His father was a wagon maker, and the family wanted more for him. They obviously were proud of their family business, but they wanted him to accomplish more. And so they pushed him at a young age to read, to learn all different kinds of things. He was just incredibly, I guess the word would be energetic, might qualify him as ADHD in today's standards. At the age of 9, he was mauled by a bear and nearly killed. He was playing with some friends and they went over to a neighbor's farm and they had a barn there with a swing set up in it. And also in the barn with a swing for the kids to play on, they kept 2 pet bears chained up, as one does. And Plum was pushing one of the kids on the swing and he slipped and rolled right into where the bears were chained up, and the bears began mauling him. Luckily for him, the bears started to then attack each other and he was able to get away. But the wounds were so severe, he lost about a pound of flesh on his leg, which for a 9-year-old is a lot. And he also got mauled across his stomach, and he was not expected to survive. This was a very brutal injury for him. During this time, he taught himself how to knit, and later on, he joked that his stitches were so tight his socks could hold water. So he was quite proud of that. Um, Obviously, he survived the bear mauling, or we wouldn't be here with this presentation. He put himself through Kenyon College at age 12. So Kenyon College was a very prestigious school. He had to get to it by walking there. And again, like I said, his family had limited means. So he had to work at the college in order to pay for his tuition. And so he did that by working at their printing press, and they printed Bibles. And so his first experience with printing was typesetting all of that tiny, tiny, tiny print for Bibles. But he found a knack for it. He enjoyed the printing press. He enjoyed the whole idea of printing, expressing thoughts on paper. And so he ended up pursuing that. Now, also, kind of what's happening at this time is we have the Free State movement. And in the interests of time, I am not going to go into the Free State movement because, well, I'm talking to the Kansas Historical Society, and so I don't need to tell you what you already know. But this was something that, even though this is going on in Kansas territory and he is in Ohio, he is very much aware of, and he's keeping track of this. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is in 1854, and at that time, he's 16 years old. So he's still 16, 17. So he's still obviously what I would consider a young kid, a high school kid, basically. And he's keeping track of all of this and what's going on. And he starts his own newspaper, also in 1854, called the Xenia News. And this is a fantastic historical resource. I included a lot of excerpts from this newspaper in my book because his writing about what was going on at the time is just great from a ethnographic type standpoint, but also it gives you a great insight into his personality and what he was thinking of things. Newspapers at that time, and as they are today, were very opinionated. And so everything he's writing is almost like an opinion piece. And in 1856, we have the sacking of Lawrence. Now, Plumb obviously is still in Ohio. He's still in Xenia, Ohio. But someone who had survived the sacking of Lawrence comes to Xenia and starts talking about it. And in those days, this was kind of how a lot of people got their news from other areas because they have newspapers, but the newspapers are only printing certain stories. And so when this person comes to Xenia and starts describing what happened, Plumb is there as a reporter. Now, I'm going to write all this down and put it in my newspaper. But what happens was he became completely enamored with the entire Free State movement and the Free State cause. He didn't want to just write about it. He wanted to become involved with it. And so what he did is he decided to immediately, and I mean immediately, within the next month, travel down to the Kansas territory. He was down in Topeka and all around there, Lawrence, all of those areas. And he's writing back to his newspaper of what he's seen. So he's basically a newspaper correspondent. And he's going around describing what's going on, describing what he sees. He's interviewing people like Charles Robinson. He's interviewing Sheriff Jones, all of these people who are famous figures from that time period. He's interviewing them for his newspaper in Ohio. And luckily for us today, those interviews survive. So that newspaper from that time period is actually not available online. The Ohio Historical Society does not have it, but famous Kansas historian William Connolly, when he was writing his biography of Plumb that came out in 1913, went through the Plumb family scrapbooks and transcribed all of these articles. And so I put those into the book so you could actually just see exactly what Plumb experienced, which has a lot of great new information. And as Plumb travels around the Kansas territory, he becomes more and more involved with the area, and he decides he wants to move there. He wants to actually settle there. And so he sells his newspaper, and he actually heads to Topeka and Lawrence, Kansas, by way of Iowa. And he does that in order to pick up some weapons to smuggle into the Kansas territory. And just as a reminder, he was born in 1837. So while this is happening, this is the fall of 1856, September. So he has not yet turned 19. He's an 18-year-old kid, I would say. And he is leading this party of men from Iowa, many of whom, almost all of whom are older than him, into the Kansas territory. And they have a cannon, they have tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, they have sharps rifles, they have all kinds of stuff, Bowie knives, thousands of Bowie knives. And they called themselves the Grizzlies. And they are traveling down into Kansas territory, going through places that are not always friendly to the Free State cause. And so they're drilling constantly, expecting to be attacked or expecting to have something like that happen to them. And so they actually make it all the way to Kansas, safe and sound, no attacks, anything like that. They drop off their cargo. And then he decides with some of the men that they want to start their own town. And so they actually start this town called Mariposa. And this again is that same time period, fall of 1856. And Mariposa was where present day Salina is. So Salina is literally right on top of where Mariposa was. And in all honesty, there wasn't a whole lot in Mariposa. There was just a few families there. Plumb was promoting it in his Xenia News. He was also promoting it in the Herald of Freedom in Lawrence, where he was working to raise money and also get the word out about the settlement. And unfortunately, they could not attract enough settlers by the time the winter came in. The winter was too harsh, and that really drove off the last of the settlers in Mariposa. And so that settlement did not work out for him. But those of you that are familiar with Emporia might recognize his name because he is one of the founders of Emporia. And so in February of 1857, the town of Emporia is founded, and he is 19 years old at this point. And he joins the town company as the fifth member. And this is because he was able to afford the $1,000 buy-in, which was a lot of money in 1857. And the other requirement of him joining the town company was that he had to start a newspaper. So this was something that he was familiar with. He had already had his Xenia News. And so he starts the Kansas News, and that's Kansas with a Z on purpose. That was in order to denote that it was a free state leaning newspaper. And getting his newspaper going was not an easy thing. As I mentioned, he's the only member of the town company to actually live in Emporia, and he had to get the newspaper printing press there from Cincinnati. And so, in order to do that, he had to go through Missouri. And at this point, because of all of his traveling around as a newspaper correspondent for his Xenia News and his involvement smuggling weapons, he was a recognized figure. He was well known. And while he was crossing the river, he was recognized by some pro-slavery men who decided, well, we know who you are. You're one of those free staters. We're going to hang you as soon as the ship docks. And luckily for him, there was another man on the steamer who took pity on him, I guess, or was impressed by him. Mostly, I think, impressed by him because the entire time, uh, Plumb, what's the nice way of saying, continued to run his mouth, basically, continuing to espout the Free State cause and talk tough, and that really impressed this guy. And so he stood up for him and saved Plumb's life. Ironically, that man's son went on to become a senator who served in the Senate with Plumb. So kind of a fun connection. But he was able to get his printing press from Cincinnati back to Emporia and start the Kansas News. Almost immediately after that, he gets smallpox. And this is sort of his second brush with death. In order to get the news for his newspaper, today we get stuff online, or, you think, oh, well, someone's emails me something, or, oh, why didn't they just get a telegram? Or well, they didn't have any of that. And so in order for him to get the news, he would have to go to the closest city and basically spend time there, talk to people, what's going on with this, what's going on with that, what new businesses are here, what's going on with politics. And so he would actually walk to Lawrence from Emporia. And I'm sure many of you have driven that. I've driven that multiple times. I cannot imagine walking there, but that's what he did. So he would be at his newspaper office. It might be 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he'd say, well, I got to go get some news to report in the newspaper. So I'll just start walking to Lawrence. And he would do that. And in the process of one of those walks, he ran across someone who had smallpox, and he was not being taken care of. And so this really upset Plumb. And so he went into town and said, isn't there somebody that can help this poor guy? And so he coordinated the care for this man, but in the process, he himself was exposed to smallpox. And he got smallpox so bad that he lost all of his hair. And if you look at some of his Senate photos, you can see the scarring on his face. It's actually something that some of the reporters later on, when he's in the Senate, used to make fun of him for. They'd call him the pockmarked senator. But really, it was almost like a war medal. You know, it was something that he had gotten these scars through his efforts to save someone else. And because he was so well known, he was elected to the Kansas State Senate. And I also want to mention he was part of the Constitutional Convention for the state of Kansas, the 1858 Constitutional Convention. So again, he was well known within all of the political figures of that time, which also I think helped to how he was elected to the Kansas State Senate. He also became a lawyer at this time. This is in 1860. And then he served as a state Supreme Court reporter. So he's got a lot going on. He's got a newspaper, he's in the state legislature, he's a lawyer, and he's a state Supreme Court reporter, all at the same time. Now, this excerpt I think is pretty funny. I always like to include this. This is actually from December of 1857 of his Kansas News. And of course, that year, Kansas was having a little trouble of keeping governors. And by the time this printed December 12th, there had already been 5 governors for the territory of Kansas, and they would have another one later that month. And so his quote, "A governor for Kansas, men of principle and conscience need not apply." This kind of sarcasm and sense of humor is him. This is his personality, and we're going to see this again and again through the rest of his life. This is why he was such a great speaker. He was so charismatic. And the other thing I like to point out, he's also trying to sell cattle. He's also a notary. He's selling land. He's selling insurance. Um, all of these things all at the same time. So just if for those of you at home that are keeping track of his jobs, he is a newspaper editor, he is a lawyer, he is selling insurance, he is selling real estate, he is a notary, and he is serving in the state legislature all at the same time, and a state Supreme Court reporter. This image here depicts a court martial that Plumb served as lawyer for. The trial was in October of 1861, so by this time the Civil War has already begun. It began in April of that year. And Plumb accompanied Blunt as a civilian militia member. And Plumb also at this time is in charge of the militia that's formed in Emporia. Because of everything that's going on with Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s and now with the Civil War going, there are a lot of bushwhackers and border ruffians coming into that area, attacking towns. And so towns have set up basically militias for their own defense. And so Plumb is in charge of that for Emporia, and then also writing on what I would call posses, chasing after these pro-slavery people who are attacking these towns. And what's also important to mention here is that this is his connection with Colonel James Blunt. Now, when he was a Supreme Court reporter, he worked with Tom Ewing, and both of these people are going to come up again with his service during the Civil War. Like I said, I'm going through this kind of fast because, oh my goodness, there is so much. So if you have questions, we'll go through those at the end. So for him, war breaks out in 1862. Now, he'd wanted to join the Civil War and enlist immediately. And he was talked out of it by the folks in Emporia because there was important things coming up in the state legislature at that time. One of them was the county boundaries and county seat designations. And they really wanted Emporia to be the county seat for Breckenridge, now Lyon County. And so they wanted him to stay in the legislature to make sure that happened. And so that postponed his enlistment in the service. But by the fall of 1862, he is ready to enlist. And so in August of that year, he recruits Company C as a recruiting lieutenant. And the 11th Kansas is led by Colonel Tom Ewing, who then serves under Blunt. And so all of these people that he knew before the war are now all starting to come back into play. His recruitment for Company C was also very interesting. Company C is primarily men from Emporia, as is part of Company E. He recruited a lot of Company E as well. But when he was recruiting, they would put up bounties. So if you enlist, we'll give you so much money, kind of a thing. And so when he was recruiting, he was putting up his own money as bounty to try to encourage enlistment. And as soon as the company is recruited and the regiment begins to form, he is promoted to captain of Company C. And once all of the companies are together, they elect officers, and he is elected major of the regiment. And again, a reason for this being he's very charismatic, he's very well known, he is very popular with the people of Kansas, and especially within multiple towns in Kansas. Because remember, he was traveling around as a newspaper correspondent with his first newspaper, the Xenia News, and again with the Kansas News. So he's very well known for all of these things. Now, the 11th Kansas as originally began as an infantry unit and was issued antiquated Prussian muskets. Excuse me. And when I say antiquated, I'm talking War of 1812, 1820s, 1830s Prussian muskets. Now, these muskets fired rounds called buck and balls, which is really it's a cartridge in a certain sense. Rather than a single bullet, it's a musket ball and then three little almost BB sized additional rounds. So it's like a cross between a musket and a shotgun. So these were pretty intense weapons, but they were heavy and they were unwieldy. They were not the best kind of weapons to have. So this is what they're issued. And there's kind of a joke amongst the men that when the 11th Kansas had target practice, people would move to the next county over. They were that effective at close range. Also, what's happening at this time is right around the Battle of Prairie Grove, just a couple days before, they come across a broken down, mostly destroyed printing press in Cane Hill, Arkansas. And so Plumb, being a newspaper man, he's got other newspapermen in the regiment. One of them is Edmund Ross, and there's some others, and they put together this printing press. They put it all back together. They carve out pieces of wood to make the buck and ball masthead that you see there. And if you look closely, and again, I don't know how well it shows up on your screens, you'll see in this first line, it says the 11th Kansas. We have been furnished by Lieutenant Greg Sergeant Tabor, and you'll see the capital T on Tabor is in italics. And if you actually read this newspaper, it is full of things like that. And as Plum joked later, it's not because they didn't know better, it's because they didn't have all the pieces. They only had so many letters of type. And so that kind of dictated some of the words that they used, and then also dictated why some things are in italics, why it might be a zero instead of an O, things like that, because they're working with found pieces of type that are scattered all over the floor of this old newspaper office, if you can imagine that. So they start their buck and ball newspaper and they start printing. It's a single sheet paper. They start printing the first side of the paper. And as luck would have it, that's when the Battle of Prairie Grove starts, December 7th, 1862. And this is their first major test of combat. And with this battle looming and starting, there's no time to sit and print newspapers. And so, in the chaos of all that, as you can imagine, Plum has to roll up all these newspapers and he throws them into the back of an ambulance that's passing by. And they go off and they fight the Battle of Prairie Grove. And this was a big deal for them. I actually have an excerpt here that we'll get to. Just me while I find it. This is an account that George Walker described, Lieutenant George Walker. And he said, we had marched all night, much of the time in timber, had passed Maysville Indian Territory, and were out in the open high prairie. 2 batteries of artillery and some cavalry had passed us since daylight. We heard firing in front of us, and the order double quick was given, and we started forward on the run, with Captain Heritage in lead of our company. And this would be Company C. I said on the run, as we were as near a run as weary men who had marched all night carrying heavy muskets and 40 rounds of 69 caliber ammunition could run, while thus making the best speed we could. Adjutant Williams met us with, hurry up, boys, or all will be lost. We needed encouragement, but this was not very encouraging. Then Lieutenant Colonel Moonlight met us with, "Hurry up, boys, or you'll miss all the fun." We were not in for fun. Then Major Plumb met us with, "Hurry up, boys, you are needed." We had gone in from a sense of duty, and here was the message we needed, and every man who heard it was goaded to do his best. In these three sentences or orders, I read the character of the men who gave them. And so that gives you an example of Plum's personality. Again, not in this for fun. We're in it because we have to be in it and because this is an important thing to do. And the 11th Kansas gets through the Battle of Prairie Grove. Um, Obviously, there's a few days spent working with the wounded, moving those that are too wounded to continue fighting, continue serving, that sort of thing. And eventually, Plum is actually able to track down all of those newspapers that they had printed. And now they have to print the second half. And so they go back to the printing press and it's been destroyed again. So they put it back together and print the second half. And the Buck and Ball newspaper now gives an account of everything that they did up into the Battle of Prairie Grove and everything that happened during the Battle of Prairie Grove. It's a fantastic historical resource, but that gives reason for why, if you look at that masthead, it says Buck and Ball, Cane Hill, Arkansas, Saturday, December 6th, but it has an account of Prairie Grove. Well, that's because it was printed, that side was printed before the actual battle. So this was something that I wish they had been able to continue. Unfortunately, General Schofield did not approve of the Buck and Ball. He was afraid that it would fall into enemy hands. It might give them too much information. And so it was seen as a liability. And so there was only ever one volume and one issue of the Buck and Ball newspaper. So for 1863, things change a little bit for them. You'll notice it says 11th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry. They were converted to a cavalry regiment. Originally, it was ordered in that spring, but really it took until the summer and late summer to be complete. And I love our government, but as we all know, government efficiency is not always our strong suit, and that has not changed. This conversion process for them was not an easy one. We had companies that got horses and no carbines. So some still had long muskets. By this point, they had been replaced with Enfield's more modern muskets, but still trying to fire a musket from the back of a horse is not an easy thing to do. And so some companies had carbines and no horses. And so it was a little bit of a fiasco. But by the end of the fall or the end of the summer, I would say end of September, most of the men have horses. Now, what's interesting here is Quantrill's raid happens August 21st of 1863, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the raid on Lawrence. Now, when this happened, this is something that Plumb took quite some heat for during the time. When the raid happened on August 21st, Plumb was in command of that district. Now, the raid was on Lawrence, Kansas. Plumb was actually in Kansas City. And so he gets word of this. By the time he's notified of this, quite a bit of time has gone by. And so he gets the men together that he has in his district. But the regiment itself is spread out along multiple districts all along the Kansas-Missouri border. And so he starts taking the men he's got and going in the direction that he believes Quantrill and his band is going. Well, he goes one direction, then he gets word that they've gone another direction, and then he goes another direction. And this whole time he's sending messengers to Ewing, trying to get him to intercept him someplace or send reinforcements, and all of them are going unanswered. And so Plumb was unable to catch Quantrill. Now, they pursued Quantrill for 24 hours straight in the saddle on an August night, which was pretty brutal. Some of the horses and some of the men actually collapsed from heat stroke. Plumb's horse collapsed and he had to get a new horse. And he had to actually be carried off the horse when their pursuit ended. And another thing to point out too is that Plumb's posse was about 100 so men. And even if he had caught Quantrill, they outnumbered them about 4-1. So I don't know how successful he would have been at stopping Quantrill had he been able to catch up to him. But this whole time of 1863, the 11th Kansas is fighting bushwhackers on the Kansas-Missouri border. This is rough duty. This is not the typical Civil War duty that we think of in the movies and that kind of thing, where, one regiment, marches out and another regiment marches out and they shoot at each other. This is guerrilla warfare. They're all along the border of Kansas, Missouri. They're broken down into small teams and they're intermixed with other regiments. So Plumb is actually commanding, groups of men from the 11th Kansas. He's also commanding some Missouri regiments. He's also commanding militiamen. It's kind of whoever is in the area and whoever can help is kind of all thrown together and they're all working on this together. And this fighting was extremely, extremely difficult. And so I want to kind of read another excerpt for you. This is actually a diary entry from October 1st of 1863. So not that long ago, at least in terms of days and months. And this is from Sergeant Sherman Bodwell. And this is just an example of basically what their daily life was like fighting bushwhackers. And he says, Thursday, October 1st, 63. Marched early, halted for breakfast when command divided. Major Plumb taking his command, companies B and H, and moving towards Napoleon. About 10 of the majors and lieutenants in the advance came suddenly on two guerrillas mounted. One dismounted and took the brush, but the major, Plumb, brought him down with his holster pistol. I rode up, the lieutenant stood over him, his pockets having been searched and papers taken. Among them, a discharge from the rebel service signed by Captain General Rains and General Price. This is Sterling Price. He was talking, claiming to be a prisoner, etc. Lieutenant asked Major Plumb, "Are you through with him?" Major Plumb nodded assent. The lieutenant said to the men standing about, "Mount your horses." And as they drew off, aimed and fired the revolver ball, striking just the back of the eye, and he was with his judge with all his imperfections on his head. The lieutenant stood between us, so I did not see his face. Sergeant Amos Custard says he instinctively raised his hand to shield himself and, quote, an ashy paleness overspread his face as when a cloud passes over the sun. This is brutal. This is not necessarily hand-to-hand combat. In some cases it was. Fighting with bushwhackers was a take no prisoners type situation. I've talked with other military historians and they've kind of likened it to GIs in World War II when dealing with members of the SS. The SS didn't take prisoners, so the GIs didn't take SS prisoners. Bushwhackers didn't take prisoners, and so troops didn't take prisoners of them. And this is something that haunted Plumb throughout his life. It's very personal. In April of 1864, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. And again, still fighting bushwhackers on the Kansas-Missouri border. And I mentioned that this haunted him, and I do want to read this example because this does, again, perfectly describe what this was like for them. And I don't like harping on this. It's not pleasant, but I really want folks to have an understanding of what this experience was like for them. This was very, very rough. This is an account that Plumb gave to a newspaper man, not actually to him. He was reminiscing with some fellow soldiers while this newspaper man was there and basically took all this down. And it said, Plumb was with a scouting party of his men in western Missouri looking for bushwhackers. It was at a time when the border struggle was as merciless as Indian warfare. The bushwhackers were looking for the scouting party. Late in the day, Plumb and his men went into camp in a ravine full of brush. They were well concealed. They had lain there resting for some time when suddenly the bushwhackers, from whom they were looking, came into view on an elevation within gunshot range. The Kansans kept very quiet, and the unsuspecting bushwhackers proceeded to make themselves comfortable in camp. In numbers, the parties were about equal. Plumb, in whispers, instructed his men to pick his bushwhacker and wait for the command. There was one left when the scouting party had been told off to cover the bushwhackers. Plumb took his gun and leveled it upon that man. To his hearers, he described the terrible sensations that went through his mind as he lay there with his rifle upon the unsuspecting enemy. The bushwhacker who had fallen to Plumb's lot finally took his seat on the ground with his back to a tree, drew from his pocket a letter, and began to read it. He sat with his full face toward Plumb. It seemed like murder, but the alternative of the situation was kill or be killed. Perhaps the wait was only a very few moments, but it took the senator much longer to describe the conflicting emotions which he passed through. At length, all was ready. Plumb gave the command in a whisper to fire. The volley rang out. The bushwhacker Plumb had aimed at fell forward dead, his hand still clasping the letter. The scene was described by the senator with awful vividness. Mr. Plumb may not have been a sentimentalist, but every minute detail of fact and every swift operation of the mind pertaining to that shooting of the bushwhacker remained with him all of his life. Now, also in 1864, the 11th Kansas is involved in the Battle of Westport. And the Battle of Westport is what we would think of as a traditional Civil War battle. So you have the Confederate Army marching out on one side and the Union Army marching out on the other. The big thing about the Battle of Westport, which happened in Kansas City, Missouri today, now it's literally under Kansas City, it was called the Gettysburg of the West because there were 30,000 soldiers involved. This was a huge, huge battle. And the 11th Kansas had a very crucial role in this battle. The Confederate Army, under the command of Sterling Price, was trying to push into Kansas. That was their goal, was to get into Kansas. And the Union had set up their army in a line blocking that advance into Kansas. And at the very bottom, at the very end, the flank of that line was Colonel Plumb with 4 companies of the 11th Kansas. And their job was to stop this advance. Now, in order to do that, they actually, Plumb led a dismounted cavalry charge up a hill to an entrenched or walled fortification where the Confederate Army was placed behind. So in other words, this is basically everything that you never want to do in the military. You always want the high ground. You don't want to go after someone who has a wall in front of them, between you and them. And this is what they did, dismounted uphill to a stone wall. And this description here, again, I don't know how well you can read it, so I'll go ahead and read it to you. This is from Private Walter Wellhouse, who is Company A of the 11th Kansas. He was one of the men who made this charge. It said, Lieutenant Colonel Plumb, with 4 companies of the 11th, was beginning his advance towards the rebels. Seeing this, the Confederates stopped short and formed a line of battle facing Plumb. Plumb marched his men across the state line to a little valley running parallel with the rebel line, and there turned up the valley, and when his troops were directly opposite the enemy, he halted them, faced them about, formed his line, and marched up the hill, his line firing at will after the first volley. Wellhouse says he never saw a finer sight. The flashes of Plumb's guns were like fireflies on a damp summer night. The advance was irresistible, and Jackman's brigade was swept from the field and rolled back with such loss that no further attempt was made in that quarter by the enemy. This is incredibly strategically significant because of the success of this charge. That stopped that advance from the Confederate Army into the state of Kansas. So now we move on to 1865. So for those of you wondering why some lady in Wyoming is talking about this Kansas senator, this is why. He's sent to Wyoming Territory in 1865, and this is actually how I first found him years ago. And so he's sent to Wyoming Territory. The reason for that being the war is winding down on the East Coast, and this is in February of 65. So even though the Civil War is not over, the war is starting to wind down. And what's happening out west is the soldiers who had been sent out here, mainly men of the 11th Ohio Cavalry, are starting to muster out. Their terms of enlistment are up. And so the government needs soldiers out here to protect the telegraph lines, because the telegraph line is what keeps communication open from California all the way to the East Coast. And so having those lines go down either by sabotage by hostile Native American tribes or literally by animals. People think of the telegraph lines as being up on these big poles and it kind of just runs through the air, kind of like a phone pole. It wasn't always like that. In fact, lots of times it's the pole and then the wire kind of just falls onto the ground and is draped on some sagebrush and just rolls along until the next pole. And so antelope, deer, buffalo, animals in the area can just basically go through the wire and break it. And so as easy as that, now all communication is severed. So this is a very critical job. And so They're actually sent to Platte Bridge Station, which, if you've been to Casper, Wyoming, that's Fort Casper. It was renamed later in 1865 to Fort Casper. So when they get sent out here, they do not want to be here, as you might imagine. Now remember, many of these men are free staters. Why did they join the army? To preserve the Union, abolish slavery. By the time they get here, they get to Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory in April of 1865. And while they're there, they're finding out by telegraph, the war's over. Yay, we can go home. And for many of the men, they signed enlistments that were 3 years or the duration of the war. Plumb was one of those men. His enlistment was 3 years or the duration of the war. So they're thinking, okay, war's over. It's time to go home. Government says, about that 3-year thing, we're going to need you to stay here in Dakota Territory in present day Wyoming. And so instead of getting sent home, they're stuck here. And so this was an extremely unpleasant situation for them, especially for Plumb. He was writing the governor of Kansas, anyone who would listen, saying, look, my men need to go home. They need to be on their farms. This is not what they signed up for. No one signed up to join the army to come out and fight Native Americans. And all of those pleas fell on deaf ears. They were not allowed to go home early. They set up their headquarters at Camp Dodge, which is something I've done a lot of research on, which is at the base of Casper Mountain here. And they were involved in various skirmishes in the area. There was a big one on June 3rd. These are instances where small groups of Native Americans would come and attack Fort Casper or Platte Bridge Station, and they would fire, gunshots at it, arrows, that kind of thing, and in hopes to pull the soldiers out and then lead them on a running chase and then eventually into an ambush. And that's exactly what happened on the skirmish on June 3rd. And this resulted in the loss of Private William Bonwell of the 11th Kansas and also Tillman Stallnecker of the 11th Ohio. And this was something that Plumb recognized. It was turning into an ambush almost immediately and gave orders to retreat, which saved the majority of the men. But this was a tactic that was used over and over again. And, part of the reason that the 11th Kansas may have been sent here as opposed to other regiments is because of the fact that they had done so much work fighting bushwhackers. Again, they were used to guerrilla warfare. And in some ways, that was similar to what fighting with the Native Americans were like. They stayed in this area until they mustered out. Some of the men were sent south, including Plumb, to Fort Halleck, Wyoming. And this is where they were in charge of protecting the overland mail route. And while they were protecting the overland mail route, they had no issues with lost mail, attacked wagons, that sort of thing. In fact, Ben Holiday, who was so impressed with Plumb's management of that route that he actually offered him a job. So when you get out of the army, come work for me. And Plumb said, no, I'm going back to Kansas. They were given the orders to muster out in August of 65, and in September of 65, they were actually out. For most of them, this was a walk. Talking about walking from Emporia to Lawrence, can you imagine walking from Casper, Wyoming to Fort Leavenworth? That would not be a fun time. But because many of the men had lost their horses, many of the horses have been stampeded by Native Americans. Then some of them had to turn some in, and so it was a brutal trek back. Now, one other thing that I do want to mention, as kind of an aside, this is an interesting thing that I'm still doing research on. But one of the things I discovered in the research of the 11th Kansas in this area is that in fall of 1864, the regiment took on 10 African-American undercooks. Now, this is not unusual for a Civil War regiment to have African-Americans serve within a white unit as cooks. But what makes this different is what I've discovered recently, according to their own regimental records, is that these undercooks were issued weapons and they fought out here. In fact, one of them, Harvey Craven, was wounded at the Battle of Platte Bridge, which for us here in Casper, this is the namesake of how Casper got its name. Lieutenant Casper Collins was killed in this battle. And one of them was wounded in that battle, and that same undercook, Harvey Craven, participated in at least two other skirmishes. And these were skirmishes that were within just a few miles from here. These were not incidents where they would have brought a cook along because they were going to be away for days. These were soldiers, every bit soldiers just as their fellow white soldiers. And not only that, some of them actually chose to keep their firearms that they had been issued by the government when they mustered out, and they paid for them. So this is something that I'm still researching, but it's kind of a unique and interesting aspect to the 11th Kansas, in that they had a certain semblance of an integrated unit, which is not necessarily all that surprising given the amount of free staters and abolitionists that were within the regiment. September 1865, home from the wars forever. That is Plumb's last diary entry from his 1865 diary. And he underlined forever. That's not my emphasis. He did that. And if you look back at when he got involved in all this, in 1856, he had been fighting for 9 years, as many of the other men had who had also been involved in the Free State movement. So this was an incredibly transformative and impactful time in his life. As we move forward, he's going to continue to have a strong military connection. I'm checking myself on time here. So in 1867, he's back in Emporia, Kansas, and he marries Carolyn Carey Southwick, from Ashtabula, Ohio. Her father, Abijah Southwick, ran a critical underground railroad stop in Ohio and was from a strong abolitionist family. So in other words, they shared very much the same opinions on things. And she would become someone that he relied on, talked to a lot about things that came up in politics, a confidant, and very powerful in her own right. Very active, founding libraries, donating to causes. Very, very strong woman. As he's back in civilian life, he becomes president of the Emporia National Bank. He returns to the state legislature and is Speaker of the House. And he is involved or founds the Ruggles and Plumb law firm. This is one of the most successful law firms in the state. They traveled all over Kansas. They took on clients in Texas. Very, very lucrative and very, very busy. But the law firm took him out of town a lot. And as he and Carrie started to have children, he kind of gave up the law. He still did the legal stuff around Kansas, but not the traveling so much, and focused on being president of the Emporia National Bank. And I know I'm running out of time and I have to get through some things, but I do want to mention this one story, just to give you an idea. Plum, as I mentioned before, is always very interested in helping people, working for people, doing things for them. And as president of the Emporia National Bank, you would not recognize it as a bank today. It was a very charitable bank under his leadership. When people needed money, he would give that to them. He would give loans without interest. In this example, this is in 1872 when the grasshoppers had destroyed almost all of the crops in the area and farmers had to replant. And it says the country was new and the farmers were poor. They really had no money from which to buy these new seeds. They came to town to see a man who kept seeds for sale, but he could not afford to sell them on credit, as he was also not financially able to do so. Some of these farmers talked to Colonel Plumb about the situation, as all the people always did talk to him about any business they had in this part of the country. Colonel Plumb told the seed man to take notes from these farmers for the seeds they required and bring those notes to the bank, and he would personally see that the bank carried them until they could be paid. The farmers in this way procured the seeds they needed and did pay all the notes except possibly one note. And so because of this, basically Plumb saves all of these farms in and around the Emporia area by basically fronting the cost of these seeds, knowing that these people don't have the money to pay it, and then not charging them interest to do so. And there are countless stories like that. Okay, finally to the Senate, and I've got, yikes, 10 minutes left. Okay, we're going to move fast. He's elected as a Republican senator from Kansas in 1877 and immediately went to work introducing bills, an extreme workaholic. This is an understatement. So Plumb had what I would call, at a minimum, a photographic memory. It was more than that. He was known for being able to do multiple things at the same time. So to give you a couple of examples, when he first started in the Senate, people would make fun of him that came into the gallery because he'd be giving a speech and then holding all these papers, and they'd say, "Oh, look at this senator. He can't even give a speech. You know, he doesn't know what he's talking about." And people that knew Plum said, "No, no, no. He's reading his mail. He's delivering this impassioned speech and reading his mail at the same time. His mind could do both." And people would come to see him in his office in Washington, and people would come in, he'd carry a conversation with someone who came in to see him while also reading the newspapers, reading and retaining the information in the newspapers, because he subscribed to every single newspaper in the state of Kansas, while reading the newspapers, holding a conversation, and also simultaneously dictating two letters to two different stenographers all at the same time. And he would just bounce from one thing to another. Other senators hated debating against him. He was very intimidating. And again, because of that photographic memory. So if an issue came up on the Senate floor, he would be able to say, well, in 1878, the steel mill produced X number of tons on this day and did this much on this day, because he retained all of this information. And so it was almost like a walking encyclopedia. Everything he read, he retained. People that he spoke to years and years earlier, he would remember them, and he would remember things that they said offhanded. He would be able to say, you know, "Senator Smith, 2 months ago, you said XYZ," and he would requote these things. And so it made him incredibly difficult to debate with other senators because he was so well versed in what was going on. And that also made him extremely powerful. He moved up very quickly in the ranks of the Senate. There's kind of an unspoken rule when you're first elected to the Senate that you just sit back and you kind of observe the lay of the land and learn your place, gradually move up. That's not him. He was in the Senate because he wanted to do things. He wanted to help people. He wasn't there to sit around and see what other senators did. So as soon as he gets there, he starts introducing bills, and the other senators are confused and saying, "Oh, who is this senator from Kansas? He's a wild man. He's just introducing bills, and then he alone votes for them." There would be bills that would come up that he didn't agree with. There's one that came up when he was first in the Senate, and everyone was for it except for him, and he was against it on principle. So he was the only senator that voted against it, and he was not afraid to do that. And so it quickly earned him respect from the other senators there. He became someone that they looked to, which leads to 1880. Now remember, he's just elected in 1877. This is only 3 years into his term. And James A. Garfield gets the presidential nomination from the Republican Party. Now, at this time, Ulysses Grant, James Blaine, John Sherman are the leading candidates. Garfield was a major general during the Civil War and an Ohio senator. He was kind of a nobody compared to these other three candidates. And the reason that Garfield got the nomination is because of Plumb. And I found this while doing my research. I actually found even illustrations of where everyone was sitting in this room when this backroom deal was hatched. And the reason that this all came about is because Plumb carried so much influence in the Senate, other senators were afraid to throw their weight behind a candidate until they knew which way Plumb was going to go. And so because of his influence and his discussions with Garfield about what this would be like for Garfield, about him running and those sorts of obligations, that's how all of this happened, which just gives you an idea of the incredible influence that he had. This is an extremely short list of his accomplishments. The first big one here is the separation of the Department of Agriculture. Now, the Department of Agriculture had been around for years, but prior to Plumb's bill, it was not its own federal department. It was not a cabinet position. Making it a cabinet position ensured that any state that had an agricultural base actually had a seat at the table with the president with all of the other cabinet departments. This was huge. This gave agriculture and agriculturally based states much more influence within the Senate. And that was Plumb's bill that did that. He also instituted the first forestry and conservation laws. Prior to this, there were no laws. And so forestry companies, timber companies were just coming in and cutting down trees everywhere. And there was no real regard for, well, this town needs to have access to lumber. Some company can't come in and just take all the timber all around this town. There has to be some kind of regulation, not only for an environmental impact, but also from an economic standpoint. If you go and obliterate all of the timber in this area, what are those people going to do to build homes and things like that? And so these first forestry laws and conservation laws that he created eventually evolve and become the U.S. Forest Service as we know it today. Also, almost during the entirety of his tenure in the Senate, he was chairman of the Public Lands Committee. Now, at the same time he's in the Senate, this is when the railroad is going across the United States. All of these different branches of railroads going into different towns and cities. And in order for those railroads to build, to go into these towns, all of that has to be approved by the Committee of Public Lands, of which he is the chairman. So he is overseeing and approving and authorizing where all of these railroads are going. Countless veterans pensions. While he was in office, he approved and fought for more veterans pensions than any other U.S. senator. At the time of his death, he had done over 6,000 pensions. And the McKinley tariff was something that's another thing that I don't have time to go into. But this was a very what's the word I'm looking for? This was not a tariff this bill was not friendly towards the American people. It was friendly towards businesses. And Plumb did not agree with it at all. And he was one of only 3 US senators who voted against it. He was offered bribes, he was threatened, they tried to intimidate him, and he said, no, I don't agree with it. I am not voting for it. And he stuck with his principles. His final campaign. So in the year of 1891, the populist movement is gaining traction, which is basically a split off of the Republican Party, and it's fracturing the Republican Party. And so this was something that Plumb was concerned about. And so he had reached out to fellow senators, trying to get anyone to kind of go around and do this campaign circuit, stump speeches all around Kansas with him, and no one would go. And so he did this himself. And so he single-handedly took on this grueling campaign schedule. And by grueling, I mean he would go to one town, he would give a speech for 3 or 4 hours, then immediately get into a wagon, ride to the next town. He would be awake for over 24 hours straight, with very little food. Sometimes he would be awake for 2 or 3 days. He would not eat for days, just to make all of these rounds to all these different campaign stops. And because of everything he was doing in Washington, he had much the same habits. He succeeded in preserving the Republican votes for the state of Kansas. Unfortunately, it cost him his life. December 20th of 1891, he suffered a massive stroke and died in Washington, D.C. Now, prior to this, he'd been having what I would call mini strokes. There's instances where he'd be coming out of the Senate and try to put, money in his pocket, and he couldn't get his hand to obey his commands, as he said. And so he'd have to ask another senator to put his wallet in his pocket. And there was instances where his vision was failing, kind of like a result of these mini strokes. This photograph is of the funeral procession for him in Topeka. This gives you an idea of how well liked and how popular he was within Kansas. So when he died in Washington, his body laid in state in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol. The vice president, chief of staff, cabinet positions, all of these people came and attended that. And then they moved the body to Topeka, where another 15,000 mourners lined the streets of Topeka and went to see his body and watch this procession. Then they brought him home to Emporia, where he was buried in the cemetery there, where another 3,000 mourners came. So almost 20,000 mourners for his funeral. This is a picture of Carrie here, and this is really just about the legacy. His sudden death threw their family into a tailspin of lawsuits and blackmail. Carrie had to fight off over 300 different lawsuits, and she won every single one. Apparently, a scam of the time was, oh, Mrs. Plumb, your husband died, and he promised that he would pay us $300 for XYZ. Won't you please pay it? And basically, this was a scam to try to get money out of grieving widows. And then also, this was other business partners who saw an opportunity to try to push her and get money. which was not successful. Carrie remained very involved in Emporia and Kansas until her death in 1919. She was very involved with the Kansas Historical Society. She donated money and land for the Carnegie Library there in Emporia, Plumb Hall at ESU. She was very involved in things going on in Emporia. And my last slide, and oh my gosh, I'm a little bit over. I wanted to share this with you. Plum was so well known at the time that he was the model for an 1890 play called The Senator. Now, the plot of the Senator play was fictitious. It's a fake concept. There are facts in it that are based in reality, but the plot itself is fake. And the main character is Senator Rivers. Now, if you look at Senator Rivers and his distinctive beard there, you might notice he looks a little bit like Plum. The entire character of Senator Rivers was a direct ripoff of Preston Plum, from his hairstyle, his clothing, his mannerisms, even his, fake backstory of being a newspaper man and all of this. This was all modeled on Plum. And it premiered in 1890 and ran for 119 performances on Broadway. It was huge. It traveled the country. It was made into a silent film in 1915, which unfortunately was lost. The script was never filed with the Library of Congress, so it is not available for theater companies to put on a production of The Senator. In my research, I found it. And we got a huge grant, like $30,000 grant up here in Wyoming, to stage a production of The Senator. And it is on YouTube. If you're interested in watching a production of the Senator, if you search for the Fort Caspar Museum Association, you can watch that play. Watching that play is as close as you can get to seeing a real life Preston Plum, as far as his mannerisms, his pattern of speaking, all of these things. I worked very closely with the actor who portrayed Senator Rivers to make sure that it was as accurate as possible. So I highly encourage you to check that out. And knowing that I've already gone over an hour, I'd like to open it up to questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here.
Joanna, that was fantastic. Thank
I
you
went
very
through it so
much.
fast.
No, yeah, well, it's a lot to cover.
It's
We
a
were
lot.
chatting before the program. I mean, you could have done the whole thing just on his time in Kansas territory. So,
Oh my
you
gosh,
you
yes,
covered a
yes.
lot. Um, well, the first comment you got from Marietta, this is fascinating. I can't believe I've never heard of him. I want to learn more about him. Thank you for your presentation. So that kind
Thank
of
you.
leads to the first natural question. Why do you think Plum is so forgotten?
So a big reason I think he was forgotten is that, how do I say, he didn't have a PR team. A lot of the stuff that Plum did, he did behind the scenes. It didn't get featured in a lot of newspaper articles. He just did these things. And when he died, the family stayed in Emporia. Now, I noticed that next month you've got a program on William Allen White. So William Allen White was a fraternity brother with Plum's son, Amos Hinsdale. Amos went by Dale. They were fraternity brothers and very good friends. And the Plum family actually helped fund William Allen White's newspaper. There would be, they were a huge part of that. And so for a time, they were very involved. Carrie died in 1919. And then the family kind of scattered. A lot of them went to California and lived there. And now in Emporia, there are descendants of his brother George, but there are no direct descendants of Preston Plum in Kansas anymore. And there hasn't been really since the teens and 20s. So I think there's just not a lot there. Um, people talking about him, that kind of thing.
Rita here says, all caps, excellent presentation. I could listen to you
Thank
for
you.
hours. Thank you.
I could talk about him for hours.
Um, but then she asks, when did you first become interested in Senator Plum?
So I found him when I was working on my master's thesis. This would have been back in 2012, 2011. So many, many years ago. And I was doing research on, I mentioned Plattbridge Station, now called Fort Caspar. and Camp Dodge. No one knew anything about Camp Dodge. When I first started, I was told it was a lumber camp. It was just some soldiers who chopped down wood, which is not what it was. It was the regimental headquarters for the entire 11th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry. And so in doing that research, I come across Preston Plumb. And so naturally, I go to Wikipedia and I start doing more research. And it's like, who is this guy? How has no one heard of him? And I actually got a research grant from the Kansas Historical Society to come down to Topeka. I did that in 2017 and got a bunch of information. And then I couldn't find all of the records that I was looking for. And on off chance, I called the Lyon County History Center in Emporia and I said, hey, do you guys have anything on Plumb? And they said, oh my God, we have a wall of boxes. And I went down there and scanned thousands of pages a few years ago. And that's what this book is part of that. It's only a fraction of that. But yeah, it all came from my master's thesis. And now, if there was a Preston Plumb fan club, I would be chairman, president, everything.
I have no trouble believing that. Mary asks, how was Plum able to start a newspaper at 16 with limited means?
With limited means, yeah. So his parents actually mortgaged their home to give him the money to do that. He was also able to recruit investments from other businessmen that believed in him. Like I said, he was incredibly charismatic, very positive. He hated cynics, absolutely hated them. He was one of those, the world is your oyster. Go forth and do what you want to do with it. And that kind of charisma really helped bring people in that would support him. But yeah, his first newspaper was his parents mortgaging their home.
Wow. Yeah, so I mean, they truly believed in him. Uh,
Yeah.
well, good for them. Um, we have Lisa here that asks if you could characterize Plum's relationship with his former commanders in the 11th Kansas before he assumed that role.
Former commanders. So like Moonlight and Ewing, I'm assuming.
Most likely.
Okay. So his relationship with them was kind of mixed. He was very good friends with Ewing, because they knew each other before the war when he was working the Kansas State Supreme Court as a reporter. Um, his loyalty to Ewing, in my opinion, went a little too far. Ewing kind of threw Plumb under the bus with Quantrill's raid on Lawrence. A lot of the reason that fell apart was because Ewing was not responding to any of those messages that he was sending. He was trying to get reinforcements, trying to get orders, trying to coordinate all this, and it was like sending messages into the void. He got no response. And instead of sticking up for Plumb, he kind of just let the chips fall and let the people of Lawrence blame Plumb, which they did for years. And so that was kind of rough. The men of the 11th Kansas did not like Ewing after that, because they were very fond of Plumb. Now, Moonlight, he and Moonlight um, seemed to start off all right on a good foot, but once they came out west, that disintegrated. Moonlight led what was called kind of a Powder River expedition, and it was this punitive expedition against Native Americans. And Plumb was one of the officers brought along on that, men of the 11th Kansas, men of the 11th Ohio Cavalry. And and I'm not joking, there was an instance where Moonlight mistook a herd of antelope for a band of camped Native Americans and sent the 11th Ohio forward to attack them, which upset, of course, the 11th Ohio. Um, Moonlight was accused of being drunk on this expedition, and Plumb basically had to put down a mutiny from the men of the 11th Kansas, and Moonlight sort of unofficially turned command over to Plumb. And Plumb was like, hey, we're going back, and took everyone back. The expedition's over. And after that, there was kind of this, I don't know if it's like jealousy or like an animosity. It was never something where there was arguments, but I think it upset Moonlight that the men respected Plumb a lot more than they did him.
That's fair. Um,
Yeah.
we have another question asking if you could speak briefly about Fort Caspar Museum's Soldiers of the Republic exhibit.
Yes. So, there's actually a whole video of it. You can see it. Unfortunately, The exhibit is down now, but I did a 45-minute walk through the exhibit where you can see everything, and I talk about all these different things and a lot of the soldiers. If you go to the YouTube channel for the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, there is a 45-minute YouTube, and I don't know if you have a way to post a link later. I can send it to you if that works, but there's a whole video of me talking about the exhibit. This was an incredibly special exhibit. As I mentioned, we had the opportunity to borrow some artifacts from the Kansas State Museum due to the convenience of having a remodel at the same time we wanted to do our exhibit. One of these was the arrows that were fired from Native Americans into Corporal Grimm's back and leg. Corporal Grimm survived the Battle of Platte Bridge, but those arrows had not been back to Casper since 1865. And so we got to put those on exhibit for folks. We had a guide on. We had a number of incredible things on loan from private collectors. One of them was a beautiful painting of Preston Plumb that I found in his old house. Some of you might be familiar with Plumb Place in Emporia. That was a women's shelter for many years. That was his house. And I found that painting many years ago while I was doing research there, and it was covered in mold. And because the house was in receivership, because the women's shelter had closed, no one technically owned it. And so I convinced our museum board up here to pay the $2,000 to clean and restore and conserve that painting, which we did. It is now resides at the Lyon County History Center in Emporia, but they let us exhibit it for a year up here. And so we had some just absolutely incredible artifacts. One of my projects has been kind of strengthening this tie between Kansas and Wyoming. I didn't get a chance to get into it, but Plumb was known as Senator of the West because Wyoming didn't become a state until 1890. He died a year after he became a state. So for 13 years, he was our senator. We didn't have Senate representation, and he was one of the only senators that would take on cases from the territories. And so when he died, there were Wyoming cattle organizations and groups that were devastated by his death. They knew him. And so he had, as someone wrote that I quoted in the book, when he was a senator, he had the largest constituency of any other senator because he was representing all of these Western territories that other senators were too busy or didn't care or didn't want to get involved with. And Plumb took that on. And especially for us, him having served out here was a very special connection for us.
Fantastic answer. Do you think if Plum never went to Wyoming, do you think he would be forgotten to you?
Probably, honestly, because I don't know that I would have come across his name. If the 11th Kansas had not come out here, I wouldn't necessarily know about them. They're one of the most famous Civil War regiments in our town. That Battle of Platte Bridge I mentioned, that same day is also the Battle of Red Buttes. They were the men involved in that battle. That's how we got our name Casper. And so having like those arrows here and that was huge. I was telling Trey earlier, one of the projects I've been doing on the board at the museum is we actually have a commemorative cemetery where we were placing headstones for soldiers who were killed in action while out here. And it's a commemorative cemetery in that the bodies aren't there. We have some unknown graves at the fort, but for most of these men, they were buried where they fell, which was along the telegraph route at long abandoned telegraph stations. And so just this past summer, I had a dedication ceremony for 9 11th Kansas soldiers who were killed out here. And we had a folded flag presentation for one of their descendants. We also did a reunion of 11th Kansas descendants out here, and I took them all around and showed them all these places where their ancestors served. And so I'm very excited to kind of bring that connection back together, and I hope I can keep that going because my experience has been that a lot of states look at it as like, well, this is our little box, and this is Wyoming history, and this is Kansas history, and this is Montana history. And it's like, no, these are all interconnected because people travel and people have an impact on other states. And, even Moonlight, he was one of our first governors, Wyoming. He came back here. So that's another Kansas connection. And so our states are very much interconnected, especially in that time period and in that topic.
Well, we had one last comment from Lisa here, asking if the Kansas Museum of History would be interested in mounting a similar exhibit featuring Preston Plum. And I am happy to say that we will have a brand new special exhibits gallery, and I think Preston Plum has enough content to probably fill it a couple times over. So,
You do,
Lisa,
and
I
you
don't know
have so
if you're connected with Fort Casper's museum or this exhibit, but feel free to get into contact with us. We'd love to work something out.
And I was going to say, you have some incredible artifacts there. You actually have a bust of him in storage. I was able to see it when I was down there, that Carrie had commissioned that used to sit in the governor's house in Topeka. And you also have a 6 foot painting of him there too, which is cool. So there was a time when he was kind of out, but now he's again the forgotten senator. But hopefully we'll change that.
Yes, yeah. One way you can do that is by buying the book. I posted the link again. I also posted the link to the Forgotten Senator, the play. So be sure to check that out. Buy a signed copy of the book. There's stickers. Slap one on your car.
Yes.
Make sure wherever you go, everyone knows who the Forgotten Senator Preston B. Plum really was.
And they're even glitter stickers because I'm sure he would love sparkles.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah. What a way to honor him. So, Joanna, thank you so much. This has been great. I've personally learned a ton. I know our viewers have. And I hope everybody here can join us next month, November 13th at 6:30 p.m. to hear Beverly Buller talk about William Allen White and the KKK in Kansas. So, from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.